let's talk a little bit about photosynthesis. Now, you may have learned about photosynthesis somewhere else. You may have only just heard the word. So what is photosynthesis? Well, by definition, photosynthesis is a process by which plants and some other organisms make food from light energy. Now, that's important to recognize that it's food that's being made. A lot of people think that plants and other organisms actually take light and directly use that energy, and that's not true. They're making food. That food has to be converted into energy somewhere else in that organism. But we'll get into that later. So the food that's being made obviously isn't burgers and fries, but it's a sugar. It's a very simple sugar that we'll talk about specifically what that is a little later in this video. And light energy, we're not talking about a weight like heavy or light. We're talking about a light source like sunlight or a fluorescent light or a light bulb. So what does the word actually mean? Well, we can break photosynthesis down into two parts. Photo, which means light. You may have heard the word photograph at some point. That is a picture that is actually created from gathering light. And then the second part of the word is synthesis, which means the creation of something, specifically by putting some things together. So if we look at that as a whole, it's putting things together, light, to make something. So what organisms can conduct photosynthesis? Well, most people start with the first one on the list, and that's the main player that people tend to think about most of the time and learn about first, and that's plants. Obviously, plants can photosynthesize, but there's some other things like algae, which is a type of plant-like protist, and some bacteria. They're autotrophic bacteria. So there are plenty of other organisms on the planet, so let's talk about the ones that can't conduct photosynthesis, the ones that can't make their own food from light. So those would be animals and fungi and the other protists, okay, the stuff that's not algae, and the other bacteria, the ones that aren't autotrophic. Now, you may notice that all three of these organisms that can conduct photosynthesis have a very specific characteristic in common. Can you see what it is? They're all green. So the question is, why are they all green? Well, that comes down to a chemical that they all have inside of their bodies, which is called chlorophyll. Now, chlorophyll is found inside of the chloroplasts of their cells. And I tend to think of this as chloroplasts are filled with chlorophyll. So what is chlorophyll? Well, chlorophyll is a chemical that's known as a pigment. So it's a green pigment. No, I don't mean it's a pigment. It's a pigment. A pigment is a colored chemical compound that absorbs light. So if you've ever walked across a hot road in bare feet on a really bright day, that road gets really hot. That's because it's actually taking the light and absorbing it and turning it into heat, another form of energy. So chlorophyll also absorbs light, and then that energy is used by that organism to conduct the process of photosynthesis. So let's talk about the actual chemical formula, and that is actually what photosynthesis is. It's a formula. Okay, so what is a chemical formula? Well, it's sort of like a recipe, right? So there's two sides to that formula or recipe. There are the raw materials, which are sort of like the ingredients, and there are the products, which is what is being made. So first we have to know what our ingredients are. So what are the raw materials that go into photosynthesis? Well, the first one is carbon dioxide. You probably have learned at some point that plants take in carbon dioxide gas. You might not have known that that was important to photosynthesis though. So what else is needed? Well, we take that carbon dioxide gas and we add water to it. We know you have to water plants to keep them alive, right? Now the next part of the equation is an arrow. Now that arrow actually means yields, which is a fancy way of saying produces. So it's sort of like an equals sign in a mathematic problem. Alright? Now, so if we're going to say this specifically, this one has light energy over it, which means yields in the presence of light energy. You remember from the definition that photosynthesis makes food from light energy. So let's talk about the products. What's made? Well, what's the point of photosynthesis? It's to make food. The food that's being made is a sugar called glucose. Now the last thing, the last product, the last part that's being made is actually a waste product, but it's really, really important to us. Can you guess what it is? You probably have learned that plants give off oxygen. So that is the basic chemical formula for photosynthesis. So if we read this from left to right, carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of light energy yields glucose and oxygen. So how exactly does carbon dioxide and water turn into sugar and oxygen? It may seem like magic, but you don't need a wizard, because it's actually science. So specifically it's chemistry. As I said, it's a chemical formula. So what you have to understand about chemistry and molecules is that molecules are made of different types of atoms that are bonded together. So they're all stuck together. Like building blocks, those atoms in the molecules can be broken apart, pulled apart. Those bonds can be broken, and then those atoms can be put back together in a different order. So it's kind of like taking your building blocks and you build a castle, and then you take those exact same blocks and you tear that castle apart and you put it back together and you build a robot. But it does take enough energy. Now, we're talking about photosynthesis, so let's think about this for a minute. Where does that energy come from? Where do we get the energy to tear those atoms apart? That's right, light energy, like sunlight. Okay, so just to show you and demonstrate this, if you look down at the bottom of the screen here, we have these really poorly drawn representations of two molecules. And there the atoms go. They've broken apart and reassembled into something completely different. It's not magic, it's science.